He fundraised millions of dollars for these companies, and his own net worth was over $150 million.
Everyone dreams of the jet-setter lifestyle.
He was living a very lavish life, and it seemed overnight that he was successful.
But success invites covetous eyes.
He embodied everything he wanted to be.
Idolatry turns to envy.
She wanted to be Fahim, and he never was gonna be.
And explodes in a brutal betrayal.
What will drive somebody to not only kill the person, but dismember his body and get rid of the evidence?
Looking at the video, we got like a ninja assassin here.
It was probably the most horrific case I was ever involved with.
This has become an international story, which put fear into people that there is a deranged killer on loose.
I never thought he would be capable of doing something like this.
It goes to show the evil that was inside him. Fahim Saleh was a giver, not a taker. He always took care of his family, and he loved his family very much.
Why do you think it's the fascination about this case?
He was wealthy, and just the nature of what a good person he was. I think it was the ability to create new ventures, to help people, to give job opportunities to the unfortunate. Someone took advantage of that.
Fahim Saleh was born in Saudi Arabia, but he came from two hardworking parents who were from Bangladesh. And at the age of 4, in 1991, they moved to America for a better life.
They initially, I believe, lived in Louisiana, and his father was working on getting his doctorate. Fahim grew up in this immigrant family that was trying to make a better life for themselves and their children. Family didn't have a lot of money, obviously, but they were a tight, close-knit family. And they eventually moved to the state of New York. So he started, his first business was selling candy bars to his fellow classmates at a markup. So he obviously had an entrepreneurial spirit. By the time he entered high school, he'd already started Prank Dial.
A lot of people may remember from the 2000s. It is a website where you're able to get somebody else's phone number and prank dial your friends.
And Prank Dial wasn't just about making money. It was really about what Fahim was at his core. He wanted to make people laugh. He had this just signature smile and laugh, and that was all about making people happy. And that's what the site was really about.
He was able to collect enough money to send himself to college.
Fahim graduated from Bentley University in 2009 and chose Manhattan as his home base.
In 2015, Fahim founded Patharo, which was a ride-sharing company in Bangladesh, which was a huge deal for him.
That was part of his mission as well. It wasn't just to, again, make money. It was to have an impact on the world, to make the world a better place.
The company was later valued to be over $100 million. 3 years later, he went on to venture into his second most successful company, Gokada, which is a motorcycle ride-hailing share company in Nigeria.
Fahim fundraised millions of dollars for these companies, and his own net worth was over $150 million. Can you imagine that? This child of immigrants was able to finally support his family in a way that he never could have imagined.
He was able to move into his first luxury complex in Lower East Side, Manhattan. It was a $2 million luxury apartment.
By May 2018, Fahim's success and growth was so rapid that he needed help. So he put out an ad for a personal assistant. After interviewing dozens of people, Fahim came across Tyrese Haspel.
Tyrese had a difficult life. It seemed as if he was walking the same path as Fahim. Tyrese was very dedicated. He was very meticulous. So I could assume that Fahim saw potential leadership qualities in Tyrese.
He saw himself in Tyrese, a young guy with a lot of potential to become an entrepreneur.
Fahim offered the personal assistant position to the 19-year-old, and Tyrese quickly accepted.
Over the next year, Fahim's success continued to grow, and he was taking Tyrese along with him as his protege, kind of putting him under his wings. The sky was the limit for Fahim.
At 3:30 p.m., Manhattan's 7th Precinct receives a frantic call from the cousin of Fahim Saleh.
We find out from the cousin that she works for him. So she had some meetings set up for him and people were calling for him and no one was able to get in touch with him. She got concerned that she wasn't able to contact him. So she decided to go to the apartment. When she walked in, she discovered his body on the floor. She immediately called 911. She was screaming. So we gathered our stuff together, me and my partners, and we went to the scene. When we arrived at the location, the cousin was in the lobby along with the victim's sister. And we got some basic information from them before we went upstairs to the apartment to take a look at the crime scene. We get inside the elevator. We go up to the 7th floor. As the doors open, you're directly inside the apartment.
When you exited the elevator, to the right, there was a bedroom. To the left, there was like a living room. When we walked into the living room, there was like a plastic bag on the floor with a torso on it. No arms, no legs, and no head.
Next to the body, they found demolition bags, each containing Fahim's body parts. They also find bloody saw and bloody scissors, which they believe was used to dismember his body.
If you look to the right of the body, along the floor, there was a bunch of cleaning supplies, gloves, cleaning solution, sponges, stuff in that nature.
There was a lot of stuff left behind. The job wasn't complete from what we assumed that they were doing.
They discover several stab wounds and 2 unknown puncture wounds.
Fahim was stabbed several times around the neck area, and he was killed first, and then the body was dismembered later on.
The medical examiner originally thought that the murder weapon had to be a knife, but the knife was missing in the crime scene. Authorities determined that Fahim's cell phone and credit card were missing, but this wasn't just a simple burglary.
A dismemberment takes time and passion and rage. So investigators know they're looking for someone who was invested in this.
What will drive somebody to not only kill the person, but to try to dismember his body and get rid of the evidence? What would bring somebody to do something this horrific?
NYPD detectives are searching the luxury Lower East Side condo where 33-year-old tech mogul Fahim Saleh was found stabbed and dismembered.
It was probably the most horrific case I was ever involved with. Just the grotesque part of it, just to dismember a body. It takes a lot to do something like that. If it was just for money, why'd you have to kill him in that way?
Looking at the apartment itself, everything seems pretty much tidy. There's nothing that's been knocked over or ransacked.
The cleaning supplies suggest that this was definitely premeditated and not a random attack. But why did the killer leave all the evidence behind? Was he interrupted? Did he need to come back?
The front door has an intercom and requires a key fob to make entrance. Someone wouldn't have just been able to walk into the building. They would have had to have been let in. So did Fahim know his killer and let that person inside?
With so many unanswered questions, the authorities began to track Fahim's last movements.
We were able to get in touch with the super of the building, which he stated that he did have video inside the entire building.
As they're watching the tape, they rewind and go to July 13th, and at 1:45 p.m., they see Fahim enter the building.
Based on his clothing, it looked like Fahim had just returned from a run.
As Fahim approaches and goes inside the elevator, he was followed in by someone who was dressed all in black, a suit and tie, a full face shield, something covering his head. He has gloves on, and he has these really strange looking boots on, like a leopard or alligator printed boots.
Looking at the video, I can remember somebody in my office actually saying, you know, like we got like a ninja assassin here.
They see that Fahim uses his fob to gain access to the 7th floor. Meanwhile, that man in this strange outfit stands on the other side in the corner.
It looked like he mumbled some words. We didn't have audio inside the elevator. As the elevator's going up and it reaches the 7th floor, the doors open. The victim goes inside his apartment, and this perpetrator appears to go inside of his jacket, pull something out, and you could see a light go on, and the victim falls to the ground.
And it looks like he tases him because you could see the spark on the video.
That explains the unknown puncture wounds that were found on his body.
We don't have any video inside the apartment, so we don't know exactly what happens after that.
Looking for clues that may help to identify the assailant, detectives continue to scrub backwards through the surveillance footage.
We keep going back and further back and further back, and he's there like 8 a.m., just lurking inside the corner. Very strange. He's waiting for the victim to show up.
The man in question is waiting for over 5 hours for Fahim.
Where'd the guy come from?
So we conduct an interview with the cousin and the sister. We take him back to the precinct interview room. We're looking to see if he had any issues with anyone, maybe a disgruntled girlfriend or boyfriend or any business people that had a problem with him. From speaking to the cousin, a lot of it was positive about the victim, Fahim. He was well liked. But as we're conducting the interview, we learned that he has a company that he runs in Nigeria, which is called Gokada. It's like a ride-sharing business. And we find out that he was having some issues with the Nigerian government.
Fahim himself felt that he was supporting countless drivers, but the Nigerian government felt like Gokada was the direct competition between their own taxi drivers.
So now, because of the Nigerian government, we started leaning toward this is a professional hit. We were concerned because if it was a professional hit, this person was probably at JFK Airport on a plane already, and he was long gone.
And ultimately, at this point, we want to put closure to this, because nobody should wind up on their living room floor like that.
Hours after finding tech CEO Fahim Saleh's dismembered body in his upscale Manhattan apartment, detectives locate security footage showing the moment the victim was tased by a masked man.
Investigators looked into that Nigerian government angle and really found no leads to support the case.
By the following day, the case has hit the news.
This has become an international story. The headlines read, "Body cut up in $2 million apartments," which put fear into people that there is a deranged killer on loose.
And with all the attention on the case, Fahim's family, of course, continued to want answers and justice. To expand the search for Fahim's killer, investigators begin to pull footage from cameras surrounding Fahim's building. Surely they'd be able to see a man in a suit and a silvery mask.
We get that video, now we want to backtrack even more. Where'd the guy come from?
And one of the detectives was able to find a person walking by, which was probably like a split second, of someone that matched the description of what we were looking for.
We wound up getting a side view shot of the perpetrator without the face shield on.
This time, though, he's not wearing that silvery face mask. He's wearing a hat, sunglasses, and a COVID-style face mask, but his ear is left exposed.
So now we have something that we can go with. We were able to determine that it was a young black male, that's someone possibly that we were looking for. So we're still, at the same time, still conducting interviews with the cousin and the sister. So I decide at the time, you know what, I have this side picture of this person. Let me just show them, see maybe they recognize him, and it can help our investigation. And I take the picture and I just slide it over to them. And as they look at it, both of them at the same time, they both gasp like that. And they say, "That's Tyrese." He was an assistant of Fahim Saleh. He worked for him.
The family is certain that it is Tyrese in that picture, but investigators can't make an arrest simply on their word alone about an ear. They need more evidence.
It wasn't 100% yet. Yeah, we still have to do a lot more work.
So it's like, whatever you're doing, drop now, find out who is this guy, where is he, what does he do?
One of my partners, he starts looking into his social media, and he finds a YouTube video that Tyrese Haspel had made. It was like a fitness video, you know, him working out, and he was able to get a side profile on the video of Tyrese Haspel. He zooms into it, makes a photo of it, and we started comparing that side profile to the side profile of what we had from the building video. I remember him coming up to me, and he goes, "Hey, Sal," he goes, "You gotta take a look at this. That's the same ear." Everybody's ear is really different. So this particular ear, the way it was shaped, the way it was going in a certain direction, you look at all those little things, you know, the nooks and crannies inside the ear, it looked like the same exact ear.
So now we're moving quicker. You know what I mean? This is just more ammunition for us.
After studying the profile of the possible killer, Fahim Saleh's family believed that the man behind the mask may not be a stranger after all, but Fahim's own assistant, Tyrese Haspel.
So we start going back days. And we have this one video where he's coming down the street on Suffolk Street, approaching the building.
But Tyrese doesn't go into the victim's building, goes into a building across the street on Suffolk Street. And well, what is he doing in there?
So we find out that there's a vacant apartment inside that building across the street. And someone contacted the realtor to look into that apartment as if he was going to rent it.
The realtor says due to COVID restrictions, he never met the prospective renter face to face. But they confirmed the name on the application was Tyrese Haspel.
They have like a little key box set up on the side of the building near the door, and they give them the code to the box.
So investigators gain access to that apartment, and inside they find a Nest camera that's pointed directly at Fahim's apartment.
Tyrese could be home looking at it on his phone, and you could see when Fahim was coming in and out of the building.
But what possible motive could Tyrese have to take Fahim's life?
Tyrese didn't have any history of violence and no history of assaults or anything like that. For a homicide of this nature, usually people have some kind of criminal history if they can bring themselves up to killing somebody like this.
So we're just like trying to get a general background on who he was, you know, as far as what kind of a guy is he.
21-year-old Tyrese Haspel was raised on Long Island.
I know Tyrese from Valley Stream Central High School, where we both ran track together on the sports teams. Tyrese was just very normal, very regular. Academically, he was very smart, and I know that business was something that interested him. He rarely talked about personal things, family life much, but I do know that he had a struggling relationship with his mother. His mom, I believe, was in and out of mental facilities.
There was no father in the picture.
So his grandmother was his full-time adult or supervisor in his life.
And later, he was sent to live with his aunt. And for a child, you don't really understand that. And you grow up just kind of feeling like my parent wasn't there for me. Most children who feel abandoned learn early on. People leave. So you put distance. You don't really get too close to people.
And it's very common from broken childhood homes that you do develop transactional relationships because there is that lack of love and empathy in your environment.
After high school, Tyrese moved to Brooklyn. And in 2018, he finally made it into the inner circle of wealth and success he had always dreamed of having.
Tyrese ran a lot of errands for Fahim and gave him access to his finances and, of course, access to his apartment.
On social media, I would see that he was living a very lavish life. He threw a lot of parties and hosted a lot of events and also had a lot of work events. It seemed overnight that he was successful.
But it was never enough for Tyrese.
Everybody wants success. And then you go home, maybe back to Long Island with a broken home perhaps, and it would be very difficult to not have the desire to keep up with it.
In Tyrese's mind, Fahim had it all: wealth, good looks, and plenty of high-rolling friends. So Fahim was really everything that Tyrese wanted to be.
Tyrese was only making $30 an hour, yet he was posting on social media of all these lavish trips. How was he able to afford this?
Detectives learned from Fahim's business associates that the CEO had recently uncovered a dark secret about Tyrese.
We learned that Tyrese was fired some time ago for stealing money. We initially learned that it was $95,000 that he had stolen from Fahim.
According to a lengthy paper trail, Fahim found out that Tyrese was creating fake PayPal profiles that mimicked his actual vendors.
He was creating accounts, paying himself.
Fahim terminated him for employment, but he said, listen, I know you were stealing this money from me. I don't want to call the police. And, it goes to show what a nice guy he was. He didn't want to ruin his life. So Fahim set up a payment plan with his lawyer that Tyrese signed, that he has to pay so much money per month until he could pay it back. So you won't call the police and get him in trouble.
I think Fahim gave Tyrese a second chance because, again, Tyrese has had a difficult life.
But Tyrese wound up never getting a job throughout the time from like January to July till this incident happened.
And we believe that he realized that he couldn't pay him back, and that gave us a potential motive of the homicide. We issue a investigation card, which wasn't an arrest warrant. It was more like we just want to talk to him, an I-card.
But when they go to his address, he's nowhere to be found.
Authorities put out a bolo for Tyrese, but they're still looking for a smoking gun.
Tyrese's debt to Fahim definitely gives him motive, but it's still circumstantial. They need something more concrete to tie him to Fahim's murder.
In order to gather more information about Tyrese, the investigators go back to the CCTV footages.
So later on in that video, the elevator doors opened up, and the perpetrator comes out with a vacuum and starts vacuuming the actual elevator. Everybody's looking at each other like, what the hell is this guy doing? Vacuuming the elevator?
We learned from another detective, he was very knowledgeable about the tasers. He said that when you shoot a taser, these little microscopic confetti-type little round identification tabs, they go all over the place, like hundreds of them.
They are called anti-felon identification. Each one of them has a serial number tying it back to the taser itself. The idea being that if someone fires a taser, they can be identified.
And he probably knew this, so he started vacuuming the area, which gave us a great lead. So we have to go back to the scene and start looking for one of these things. We actually shut the elevator down, and we got really lucky. One of the detectives found one of the AFib tabs located on a molding piece right outside the elevator door. And we were able to zoom in on it and get a serial number off of it. And we called the company that manufactures them, and they were able to provide information for it. It was found that Tyrese had ordered this taser a month prior in June, and it was sent to his home in Brooklyn. So that was the nail in the coffin, as we call it. And that's when we had everything we needed.
We got to find them. And we don't stop, until it's over.
While investigating the shocking murder of tech mogul Fahim Saleh, detectives find evidence linking his assistant, Tyrese Haspel, to the crime. But they can't find Tyrese.
With Tyrese presumably on the run, investigators pull his phone records to see his movements.
We find out that he took an Uber from the scene after the homicide, and we get information from the Uber that he used that it went to Jersey City at a certain location and dropped him off. We sent a team out to New Jersey. We find a camera facing the location of where he was dropped off. We see him get out of the Uber car, walk toward the water on the Jersey side of the Hudson, and he was carrying a bag, and it looks like he dropped something in the water.
So we took one of our police boats out to the Jersey side, and scuba guys, and met up with all those guys over there, and we were searching for, What we thought was in the bag was probably the taser, the knife. The knife was never recovered from him being stabbed.
They were not able to find anything.
But detectives catch a...
His credit card has been used to purchase balloons, a cake, several Louis Vuitton items, and a $1,000 a night Airbnb rental.
So investigators pull surveillance footages from around the Airbnb and find Tyrese walking with a woman.
So once the prosecution gave the okay, we let the violent felony squad know, and they went to that location. And as they were walking into the building, he was walking out with his girlfriend, and they were able to put him under arrest. He didn't resist. The girlfriend looked like she was a little shocked about what was going on.
Tyrese is immediately transported to the 7th Precinct for questioning.
In the interrogation room, Tyrese is calm and poised.
He was actually really nice. He didn't say much at all.
But he wanted a lawyer at that point. He wasn't going to speak to us. So we went and spoke to his girlfriend, me and Sal. We interviewed her.
She was from France. She had broken English. And I remember asking her if she knew when Tyrese was terminated from his employment with Fahim. And she didn't know, she stated.
She said, well, he gets up every day and goes to work. He's got all this money. He takes me here, he takes me there.
It looked like he was really in love with her, and he would do anything for her.
On social media, I would see that he spoiled her financially a lot. He did a lot of extravagant gifts for her. He did a lot of birthday festivities for her. I think those are things that were important to her, and she was important to him. So he did whatever means financially to keep that going.
After the interview was done with her, we had no evidence to tie her to any part of this, so she was let go.
Tyrese Haspel is ultimately charged with first-degree murder, larceny, and burglary, to which he pleads not guilty.
Four years later, Tyrese is led into a Manhattan courtroom to stand trial.
So a lot of these cases try to go with an insanity plea, but instead they went with the theory that Tyrese was emotionally disturbed because he was so in love with his girlfriend that he didn't want to disappoint her.
Extreme duress, because your girlfriend wants to hang out and do lavish things and wants lavish stuff. That's a defense. I think she wanted to be Fahim. He just wasn't. And he never was gonna be.
In May 2024, 21-year-old Tyrese Haspel is on trial for murdering his former boss, tech CEO Fahim Saleh.
They offered him a deal of 33 years to life, and he turned it down. He wanted to go to trial.
Tyrese's defense is that he was suffering from extreme emotional disturbance when he attacked and killed Fahim, a mitigating factor that, if proven, could reduce Tyrese's prison sentence by up to 15 years.
They went with a theory that Tyrese was emotionally disturbed because he was so in love with his girlfriend that he didn't want to disappoint her.
Surprisingly, Tyrese decides to testify and confesses in shocking detail. While living on Long Island, he wasn't this intrepid entrepreneur as he'd led Fahim to believe. In fact, he worked at a restaurant where he was fired. Tyrese fabricated a resume when he came across a handsome, self-made millionaire who embodied everything he wanted to be. Tyrese knew he had found the perfect target.
I think Fahim, coming from a background with hardworking parents, he wanted to have generosity and see the kindness in people. And I think that's how Tyrese was able to fool Fahim, almost using kindness against him.
It was during his early employment for Fahim that Tyrese met his girlfriend, a French foreign exchange student. He then began to buy her lavish gifts, something he soon realized he couldn't afford to do because he wasn't wealthy. That's when he realized he needed more money than his weekly paychecks would allow.
He didn't want to disappoint her. He would buy her expensive bags and clothing with money he was stealing from Fahim.
And it turns out that the $95,000 Tyrese stole from Fahim was just the tip of the iceberg.
When they did a forensic dive, they went from 95,000 to 400,000, on actually how much money this kid took from him. So he couldn't pay that money back.
We believe that he was planning to kill Fahim for at least several months, maybe even longer than that. But from the evidence that we gathered, it looked like it was at least 3 to 4 months.
Disturbing searches on Tyrese's computer showed he'd searched for how to get away with murder and how to dismember a body. On the day of the murder, July 13th, 2020, Tyrese waited in the lobby for 5 hours to make sure he wouldn't miss Fahim's return. According to Tyrese, Fahim looked at him in the elevator and said, "You're really taking this COVID seriously." Moments later, Tyrese shot him in the back with a taser as Fahim cried out, "What are you doing?"
He was then stabbed around the neck area, killed, and then his body was dismembered.
Tyrese said he didn't feel anything while dismembering Fahim's body, and the only reason he stopped is because the battery in the saw died, and he left to get a charger. But when he returned to the building, Tyrese said he saw police activity and fled the area. That very same day, after Fahim's murder, he used his credit card to begin planning an extravagant birthday celebration for his girlfriend in an Airbnb.
The lack of empathy you would correlate with people who would generally be like sociopaths. Like, I don't feel anything, like this is mine. Like that sense of entitlement, the grandiose ideas, like this is mine.
It goes to show the evil that was inside him. That's pure evil.
On June 24th, 2024, after a long COVID delay, Tyrese is found guilty and sentenced to 40 years to life for Fahim's murder.
At the sentencing, I remember Fahim's father gave a long speech, and I remember asking Tyrese, why'd you have to kill my son? Why kill him just for money? He would have gave it to you if you asked for it. And, why'd you have to kill him in that way? And it broke my heart.
Tyrese became overwhelmingly envious of Fahim, his wealth, his success, his entire life. So he decided to take it. It was the ultimate betrayal because Fahim had believed in Tyrese, had taken him under his wing, and was hoping to help him. And in the end, he killed him.
I think that justice was served to the family, but truly, it'll never bring Fahim back. And there is no sentence long enough to help someone grieve through that.
On a cold January morning in Arlington, Texas, a door remained closed far longer than anyone expected. Inside was a scene that would haunt investigators for more than a decade. A young woman. A home that should have been safe. A violent attack so brutal that even experienced detectives struggled to understand how someone could commit such a crime and disappear without leaving a clear trail. Her name was Iracema Chavez. She was 32 years old. A daughter. A friend. A woman with a future that was suddenly erased in a single night. For years, her name would exist in the files of an unsolved homicide. A case number buried among thousands of cold cases across America. A murder surrounded by questions. A crime scene filled with evidence, yet missing the one thing investigators desperately needed. A name. Who walked into Iracema Chavez's apartment that night? Who stood inside her home? Who turned a familiar place into a scene of unimaginable violence? And how could the person responsible live for years knowing that one tiny piece of evidence was waiting in the shadows? Because 14 years later, the silence would finally begin to break. A microscopic clue. A hidden biological signature. A piece of DNA that survived when memories faded and witnesses moved on. A clue that would transform one of Arlington's most disturbing mysteries. But before the breakthrough, before the arrest, before the world learned that the answer had been hiding in plain sight, there was only one thing left behind. A crime scene. And a community demanding answers. January 20th, 2012. The morning began like any other day in Arlington, a city between Dallas and Fort Worth where thousands of residents lived ordinary lives, unaware that one apartment complex would soon become the center of a horrifying investigation. At approximately 8:51 a.m., police received a call reporting that something was wrong inside an apartment on South Collins Street. A family member had discovered Iracema Chavez unresponsive inside her home. When officers arrived, they found a scene that immediately changed the nature of the investigation. Chavez was dead. Investigators later described the attack as exceptionally violent. She had suffered approximately 100 stab wounds. The brutality suggested not a random encounter, but an act filled with rage, intensity, and personal connection. The apartment became a maze of questions. There was no simple explanation. No obvious suspect waiting outside. No confession. No clear motive. Only fragments. Detectives began the painstaking process of reconstructing the final moments of Chavez's life. Every object mattered. Every fingerprint. Every footprint. Every trace left behind by someone who believed they could escape forever. One of the first major questions was also one of the most important. Why was there no obvious sign of forced entry? For investigators, that detail changed everything. If the killer did not break into the apartment, then perhaps the victim knew the person who entered. Perhaps the attacker was someone Chavez trusted. Someone she recognized. Someone she allowed inside. That possibility made the case even more disturbing. Because the danger had not necessarily come from outside. It may have come through the front door. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives collected evidence from the apartment. They searched for witnesses. They examined surveillance footage from the area. They followed every possible lead. And among the evidence recovered was a biological clue connected to the unknown person responsible. A DNA sample. At the time, forensic technology was not advanced enough to provide the answer investigators needed. The profile did not match anyone in available databases. The evidence existed. The killer's genetic fingerprint existed. But the identity behind it remained hidden. The case entered a painful stage familiar to families of cold case victims. Waiting. Days became months. Months became years. The headlines disappeared. The public moved on. But for Chavez's family, there was no moving on. A murder does not end when the news cameras leave. It continues in empty rooms. In unanswered phone calls. In birthdays without a loved one. In the constant question that follows every unsolved case. Why? Investigators refused to close the door completely. They continued reviewing evidence. They continued looking for connections. They continued searching for the person responsible. But the years created distance. People changed. Memories became less reliable. Potential witnesses moved away. And the killer remained unidentified. The case became what law enforcement calls a cold case. A phrase that sounds final. But cold cases are rarely truly forgotten. Because evidence does not age the way people do. DNA does not forget. And sometimes, the smallest trace left behind at the beginning of an investigation can become the strongest weapon years later. In 2016, investigators revisited the DNA evidence connected to Chavez's murder. Advanced forensic methods allowed authorities to create additional information from the genetic material collected at the crime scene, including a predicted image of what the unknown individual might look like. But even with new technology, the identity remained elusive. The case remained frozen. A mystery locked in time. Then came a new era in criminal investigations. A revolution that changed how detectives looked at forgotten crimes. Investigative genetic genealogy. A technique that could take unknown DNA and search for connections through family relationships, building genetic family trees that could lead investigators toward an identity. For decades, killers had relied on one assumption. That time would protect them. That evidence would disappear. That forgotten cases would stay forgotten. But technology was changing the rules. In 2024, Arlington police partnered with the FBI to re-examine the evidence using advanced genetic genealogy methods. The investigation that had stalled for years suddenly began moving again. Behind the scenes, investigators followed a trail that had been invisible in 2012. A trail made of genetic connections. A trail that reached into family histories. A trail that slowly narrowed the impossible question. Who killed Iracema Chavez? The answer was no longer somewhere in the darkness. It was getting closer. But as detectives moved toward a suspect, another shocking realization began to emerge. The person they were looking for was not a stranger hiding in the shadows. The case was about to reveal something far more unsettling. Because sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are not created by unknown monsters. Sometimes they are created by people who were already part of someone's life. And after 14 years of silence, the investigation was finally approaching the moment when the past would collide with the present. A single DNA clue was about to reopen one of Texas's most haunting cold cases. And the question that had followed Iracema Chavez's family for more than a decade was finally close to being answered. Who was the person standing on the other side of that apartment door? For more than a decade, the apartment where Iracema Chavez took her last breath existed only as photographs sealed inside evidence binders, diagrams preserved in detective files, and memories carried by the investigators who had walked through the blood-stained rooms on that January morning. The furniture had long since been replaced. New tenants had come and gone. The neighborhood continued with its routines. Cars filled the parking lot. Children played outside. Life moved forward as it always does. Yet somewhere inside a secured evidence room, the the smallest fragments collected from that apartment remained untouched, waiting for science to catch up with a killer who believed time had erased his trail. Cold cases often die quietly. Budget priorities shift. Detectives retire. Witnesses relocate. Evidence sits in climate-controlled storage while newer crimes demand immediate attention. The passage of time becomes an invisible ally for offenders, slowly eroding memories, weakening testimony, and reducing the likelihood that anyone will remember a suspicious face seen years before. It is why so many homicide investigations eventually reach a point where every obvious lead has been exhausted. The Chavez investigation reached that point. Every interview had been reviewed. Every known associate had been considered. Potential suspects had provided statements. DNA profiles had been compared against available law enforcement databases, producing no identification. Nothing pointed decisively toward the person responsible. To outsiders, the investigation appeared stalled. Inside the Arlington Police Department, however, the file never truly disappeared. Experienced homicide detectives understand something many people do not. A cold case is not necessarily an impossible case. It is simply a case waiting for something new. Sometimes that something new is a witness burdened by guilt. Sometimes it is a confession. Sometimes it is an overlooked piece of physical evidence. And increasingly, it is technology. By the early 2020s, forensic science had undergone a transformation unimaginable when the investigation first began. DNA analysis had become dramatically more sophisticated, while investigative genetic genealogy had demonstrated its ability to identify suspects in cases that had remained unsolved for decades. The technique had already helped investigators across the United States identify offenders who had escaped detection for years by tracing distant biological relationships rather than relying solely on direct matches in criminal databases. The concept sounded almost impossible. A suspect could avoid arrest. He could never be convicted. He might never submit DNA to law enforcement. Yet investigators could still begin finding him through relatives who had voluntarily shared their genetic information with genealogy services that permitted law enforcement use under specific circumstances. Instead of asking whose DNA this is, detectives could begin asking another question. Whose family does this DNA belong to? That subtle difference changed everything. The Arlington Police Department decided it was time. The biological evidence recovered from the Chavez homicide would once again become the center of the investigation. This time, detectives were no longer relying on the technology available in 2012. They were entering entirely new territory. The preserved DNA profile was submitted for advanced analysis using investigative genetic genealogy. Working alongside specialized forensic experts and the FBI, investigators began constructing family trees based on distant genetic relationships. It was painstaking work requiring months of research, historical records, birth certificates, marriage records, census information, and countless hours verifying biological connections. There was no instant answer. No computer simply printed the killer's name. Instead, every discovery narrowed the possibilities. Every branch removed from the family tree reduced the number of individuals who could have contributed the DNA recovered from the crime scene. The investigation became less about searching for strangers. It became a process of elimination. As genealogists reconstructed generations of family relationships, detectives quietly compared ages, locations, employment histories, and personal connections. Who lived near Arlington? Who would have been an adult in January 2012? Who had access to the victim? Who fit every known circumstance surrounding the homicide? Weeks turned into months. The family tree grew larger. Then smaller. Eventually, investigators arrived at a single individual whose background demanded closer scrutiny. His name was Rudy Ornelas. Unlike the frightening image often associated with serial predators hiding in isolation, Ornelas had spent years living an ordinary public life. People knew him. He worked. He interacted with neighbors. He moved through society without attracting the attention reserved for violent offenders. Nothing about his daily routine suggested that investigators had quietly begun examining him as a possible suspect in one of Arlington's oldest unsolved murders. Detectives now faced a new challenge. Genetic genealogy can generate investigative leads. It does not itself prove guilt. To make an arrest, investigators still needed a direct DNA comparison. They needed Ornelas's own biological sample. Without alerting him. Without jeopardizing the investigation. Experienced homicide investigators understand that surveillance is often less dramatic than television portrays. It consists of patience. Long hours. Observation. Waiting for opportunities. Following routines. Watching someone who has no idea he is being watched. Detectives monitored Ornelas carefully. They learned his habits. His movements. His schedule. The investigation that had remained silent for years suddenly became active again, though almost no one outside law enforcement realized it. The family of Iracema Chavez also knew very little about what was happening. Investigators are often cautious when significant forensic work is underway. Raising expectations too early can create devastating disappointment if a promising lead ultimately proves incorrect. So the family continued waiting. As they had waited for years. Without knowing that the case had entered its most important phase since the morning of the murder. Meanwhile, detectives searched for the opportunity they needed. The law generally permits investigators, under appropriate legal standards, to collect abandoned DNA, genetic material left on items a person voluntarily discards in public. Such evidence has become an important investigative tool in numerous cold cases because it allows law enforcement to compare a suspect's DNA without requiring immediate arrest. One discarded item. One biological trace. That was all detectives needed. Eventually, investigators obtained a DNA sample associated with Ornelas through lawful investigative means. The sample was submitted to the laboratory. Then came another period of waiting. Laboratory analysis cannot be rushed. Every comparison must withstand courtroom scrutiny. Every procedure must be documented. Every possibility of contamination must be eliminated. The evidence would either confirm investigators' theory or destroy it. For the detectives who had spent years pursuing justice for Chavez, the stakes could not have been higher. If the DNA failed to match, the investigation might return to uncertainty. If it matched, everything would change. Inside the laboratory, forensic scientists compared the newly obtained DNA profile with the biological evidence preserved from the apartment in 2012. Numbers. Genetic markers. Statistical probabilities. Science replacing speculation. Unlike eyewitness testimony, DNA carries extraordinary evidentiary value because it does not depend on memory. It does not forget. It does not become confused over time. Its language is mathematics. Its conclusions are measured in probabilities so overwhelming that coincidence becomes virtually impossible. When the analysis was complete, investigators received the answer they had spent more than a decade pursuing. The DNA matched. The unknown biological profile collected from the crime scene belonged to Rudy Ornelas. 14 years after the murder of Iracema Chavez, the anonymous genetic signature finally had a name. For detectives, the moment was extraordinary. Years of uncertainty collapsed into certainty. The invisible suspect became a real person. The unidentified DNA profile transformed into probable cause. But even then, investigators moved carefully. An arrest in a homicide case requires meticulous preparation. Every report had to be reviewed. Every piece of evidence re-examined. Prosecutors evaluated the case to ensure that the evidence assembled over 14 years would withstand the intense scrutiny certain to accompany a murder trial. Detectives revisited old interviews, old photographs, old forensic reports. Details that once seemed insignificant suddenly acquired new meaning when viewed through the lens of a named suspect. Questions emerged that had never been answered. Had Ornelas known Chavez personally? How had he gained access to the apartment? What exactly happened during those final moments? What triggered such extraordinary violence? The DNA identified a suspect. It did not explain the motive. It did not reconstruct the attack. It did not tell investigators what words were exchanged before the violence erupted. Those answers remained hidden. Even after science had solved one mystery, others continued to linger in the shadows. As prosecutors prepared for the next stage, detectives understood that another emotional moment lay ahead. Someone would have to contact the Chavez family. Someone would have to tell them that after 14 years, investigators believed they finally knew who had murdered their daughter. It was the phone call every family hopes will someday come. And the one detectives never forget making. The silence surrounding the murder of Iracema Chavez had lasted nearly a generation. It was finally coming to an end. But identifying the suspect was only the beginning. The arrest itself, and the questions that followed, would expose just how fragile the illusion of safety had always been, and how a single microscopic strand of DNA had quietly waited 14 years to tell the truth. For 14 years, Rudy Ornelas had lived in the ordinary rhythm of everyday life while the investigation into Iracema Chavez's murder remained trapped inside aging case files. Every birthday, every holiday, every routine trip to work unfolded against a backdrop of silence that investigators were determined to break. They had spent years looking at an unknown DNA profile, wondering whether the person behind it had left Texas, changed identities, or even died. Now, they knew the name attached to that profile. The mystery had narrowed from an invisible figure to a single man. The discovery changed the entire atmosphere inside the Arlington Police Department's homicide unit. The case was no longer a question of who. It had become a question of how. How would investigators bring him into custody? How would they present more than a decade of evidence to prosecutors? And perhaps most importantly, how would they explain to a grieving family that science had accomplished what time had not? Before any arrest could be made, detectives assembled every piece of evidence collected since January 2012. Old photographs were reviewed one more time. Crime scene diagrams were examined with fresh eyes. Witness statements that had once seemed disconnected were read again, this time through the lens of a known suspect. Every report was scrutinized for consistency. Every procedural step had to withstand defense challenges that would almost certainly come once the case entered a courtroom. Experienced investigators understand that cold case arrests are often more demanding than arrests made days after a crime. Time complicates everything. Witnesses forget details. Some witnesses can no longer be found. Others have passed away. Businesses that once held surveillance footage no longer exist. Physical locations change. Buildings are renovated. Roads are widened. Entire neighborhoods evolve. Evidence becomes priceless. Every preserved photograph. Every laboratory report. Every chain of custody document. Every handwritten detective's note from 2012 suddenly carried renewed significance. The DNA match was powerful, but prosecutors wanted to ensure the case presented to a jury would tell a coherent story supported by every available fact. Investigators also revisited the relationship between Rudy Ornelas and Iracema Chavez. Publicly available court records have not fully detailed the complete nature of every interaction between the two before the homicide. What investigators have indicated is that the evidence ultimately supported charging Ornelas with Chavez's murder after the DNA breakthrough identified him as the suspect. Certain aspects of the relationship and the motive remain matters to be addressed through the judicial process rather than established historical fact. That distinction mattered. Detectives were careful not to allow assumptions to replace evidence. Speculation has destroyed countless investigations. Facts solved them. The brutality of the attack continued to stand out as one of the most disturbing features of the case. Approximately 100 stab wounds. That number alone had shocked investigators in 2012. It continued to shock them 14 years later. Criminologists often note that extreme overkill may indicate intense emotional violence, but it does not automatically reveal motive. Every homicide is unique, and investigators avoid drawing simple conclusions based solely on the severity of injuries. Still, one question lingered. What happened inside that apartment during the final moments before the attack? Did an argument escalate suddenly? Did Chavez recognize immediate danger? Did she attempt to escape? The apartment had contained signs of a violent struggle. Investigators believed she fought desperately for her life. Every defensive wound. Every displaced object. Every bloodstain documented a battle that lasted only minutes but permanently altered countless lives. Those minutes became the center of an investigation stretching across 14 years. While detectives prepared their case, surveillance quietly continued. They observed Ornelas carefully. There was no dramatic confrontation. No high-speed pursuit. No frantic escape attempt. Instead, law enforcement relied on patience and planning, understanding that a carefully executed arrest reduces unnecessary risks for everyone involved. By the time officers moved to take Ornelas into custody, they had already built the foundation for prosecution. The arrest itself marked the end of one chapter. It also marked the beginning of another. Cold case arrests often generate intense public attention because they challenge a common assumption, that enough time can erase accountability. When the news became public, many people expressed the same reaction. 14 years. How could investigators still solve a murder after 14 years? The answer lay inside a freezer. Inside carefully preserved evidence envelopes. Inside laboratory protocols followed meticulously by technicians who understood that even microscopic biological material might someday identify a killer. The story was no longer simply about one homicide. It had become a demonstration of how modern forensic science was reshaping criminal investigations across the United States. Families who had nearly abandoned hope suddenly saw possibility. Detectives working other cold cases saw renewed motivation. Cases that had gathered dust for decades were once again being opened. Because every unsolved homicide now carried a question. What if today's technology can solve yesterday's crime? For the Chavez family, however, scientific advancement was only part of the story. Their reality was deeply personal. No forensic breakthrough could restore the daughter they had lost. No arrest could erase 14 years of grief. Justice, if it came, would never mean closure in the absolute sense of the word. Loss does not disappear because someone is charged with a crime. It simply changes shape. The phone call informing them that a suspect had finally been identified reportedly brought emotions that are difficult to describe. Relief. Disbelief. Hope. Pain. Questions accumulated immediately. Why had it taken so long? Why Hiroshima? What had happened inside the apartment? Would the suspect explain anything? Or would silence continue even after the arrest? Families in cold case investigations often discover that solving the mystery does not eliminate uncertainty. Instead, new uncertainties emerge. Will there be a conviction? Will the evidence survive legal challenges? Will there ever be an explanation that truly makes sense? Meanwhile, prosecutors began preparing for the legal process that lay ahead. Unlike fictional crime dramas, homicide prosecutions unfold methodically. Evidence must be disclosed. Defense attorneys review forensic reports. Experts prepare testimony. Laboratory procedures are examined in extraordinary detail. Every scientific conclusion is expected to withstand rigorous cross-examination. DNA evidence is exceptionally persuasive, but it is never presented in isolation. Jurors are asked to evaluate the entire picture. The crime scene. The timeline. Witness testimony. Forensic analysis. Investigative procedures. Each element supports the others. Each becomes part of a narrative built not on speculation, but on evidence. As journalists revisited the Chavez case following the arrest announcement, they reminded the public how abruptly the investigation had disappeared from headlines after 2012. Like many homicide victims, Hiroshima Chavez had briefly become the focus of widespread attention before the news cycle inevitably shifted elsewhere. That is often one of the cruelest realities faced by victims' families. The world moves on. They cannot. For them, every anniversary revives the same questions. Every birthday becomes another reminder of absence. Every family gathering contains an empty chair. The arrest forced many people to remember a name they had not heard in years. It also highlighted another truth about violent crime. Some offenders are not captured because witnesses identify them. Some are not caught because they confess. Some are caught because science quietly waits for the day when it can speak with certainty. As investigators reflected on the case, many recognized the importance of one decision made back in 2012. The decision to preserve every possible piece of biological evidence. Without that evidence, there would have been no genealogy. No DNA comparison. No identified suspect. No arrest. The smallest fragments collected during those first difficult hours had ultimately become the strongest voice for a woman who could no longer speak for herself. Yet despite the dramatic breakthrough, significant questions remained unanswered. The public knew a suspect had been arrested. The family knew investigators believed they had found the killer. But the deeper mystery, the human story hidden behind the violence, remained incomplete. Why had this encounter turned fatal? What circumstances led to such extraordinary brutality? And would the courtroom finally reveal the answers that had remained buried alongside the evidence for nearly a decade and a half? Those questions now moved from the investigation room to the courtroom, where science, memory, and justice would soon meet under oath. When a homicide investigation reaches the courtroom after more than a decade, time becomes both an ally and an adversary. It helps preserve scientific certainty. It erodes human memory. Jurors may hear testimony about events that occurred years earlier, in places that have changed, involving people whose lives have moved in entirely different directions. Detectives who first responded to the scene have accumulated years of additional experience. Some have retired. Others have transferred to different divisions. Yet the evidence remains frozen in the moment it was collected, preserving a snapshot of a crime that refused to disappear. The murder of Iracema Chavez had now crossed that threshold. For years, it had existed as a cold case. Now, it stood as an active prosecution. Every decision made by investigators in January 2012 would be examined under a microscope. Defense attorneys in homicide cases routinely scrutinize every procedural step. Who collected the evidence? How was it packaged? Who transported it? Where was it stored? Who had access to it? Could contamination have occurred? Was every laboratory protocol properly followed? These questions are not unusual. They are the foundation of the criminal justice system. A conviction must rest on evidence that can withstand rigorous examination. In the Chavez investigation, detectives had spent years preserving biological evidence under controlled conditions. Chain of custody records documented every transfer, every examination, every laboratory submission. That documentation would become as important as the DNA itself, demonstrating that the evidence analyzed years later was the same evidence recovered from the apartment on the day of the murder. Forensic scientists prepared to explain concepts that many jurors might never have encountered before. DNA profiling. Genetic markers. Probability calculations. Investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike television dramas, these explanations are rarely dramatic. They are methodical, technical, carefully worded. The goal is not entertainment. It is clarity. Jurors must understand not only what the evidence shows, but also how investigators reach their conclusions. One distinction would become particularly important. Investigative genetic genealogy was not presented as proof of guilt. It served as an investigative tool that generated a lead. The decisive scientific evidence came later, when investigators obtained a direct DNA sample associated with Rudy Ornelas and compared it with the biological evidence preserved from the crime scene. That comparison produced the match that transformed suspicion into probable cause. It was an important legal distinction. The genealogy pointed detectives toward a suspect. The direct DNA comparison confirmed the forensic connection. As prosecutors organized their presentation, they also revisited the timeline surrounding the murder. The events inside the apartment had unfolded quickly. Violence often does. Minutes can produce consequences that echo across decades. Investigators reconstructed every known movement leading up to the discovery of Chavez's body. Telephone records. Witness statements. Physical evidence. Each piece occupied its own place within the larger narrative. Some questions remained unanswered. Public records do not establish every minute of Chavez's final hours. Nor do they explain every action taken by the suspect before or after the attack. Such gaps are common in homicide investigations, particularly those without surviving eyewitnesses. The absence of complete knowledge does not prevent prosecution. It simply reminds everyone that crime scenes rarely tell the entire story. Only fragments. Only evidence. Only traces left behind. Outside the courtroom, the renewed attention surrounding the case produced another consequence. People who had not spoken about the murder in years suddenly found themselves answering questions again. Neighbors recalled the shock that swept through the apartment complex in 2012. Some remembered seeing police vehicles lining the parking lot. Others remembered news helicopters circling overhead. Many admitted they had assumed the case would never be solved. Cold cases often create a quiet sense of resignation within communities. Residents begin believing that justice has slipped beyond reach. The arrest challenged that belief. If a 14-year-old murder could still be solved, perhaps other forgotten investigations might also find answers. For the Arlington Police Department, the Chavez case became an example of persistence rather than luck. Detectives emphasized that the breakthrough had not occurred because someone stumbled upon new evidence hidden in a box. It occurred because investigators deliberately revisited existing evidence using modern scientific methods. The biological material had always been there. Science finally caught up. That lesson carried significance far beyond one homicide. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies maintain thousands of unsolved murders containing preserved biological evidence. Some date back 20 years. Some 30. Some even longer. Every advancement in forensic technology increases the possibility that another forgotten file may someday return to active investigation. Every successful prosecution encourages agencies to reopen additional cases. For families waiting decades for answers, those developments represent something more valuable than headlines. They represent hope. The Chavez family understood that hope better than anyone. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. The arrest did not erase the pain. But it replaced one unbearable question with another. Instead of asking, "Who did this?" they could finally ask, "Will justice be served?" That distinction mattered. Justice and closure are often spoken about together, but they are not the same thing. Justice belongs to the legal system. Closure belongs to the human heart. One can exist without the other. As the case advanced, journalists revisiting the investigation inevitably focused on one haunting detail. Approximately 100 stab wounds. The number dominated headlines. It shocked readers. It raised countless theories. Yet experienced investigators resisted sensational conclusions. The severity of violence does not automatically identify motive. It cannot reveal precisely what emotions drove the attacker. Every homicide exists within its own unique context. Speculation may satisfy curiosity. Evidence satisfies courts. That principle guided every public statement made by investigators. They spoke carefully. Deliberately. Avoiding claims that extended beyond the evidence. It is one reason cold case prosecutions often succeed. Discipline. Patience. Precision. The investigation had already survived 14 years. Detectives refused to jeopardize it through unnecessary speculation. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued preparing expert witnesses. Laboratory analysts would explain DNA science. Detectives would describe the crime scene. Evidence technicians would document collection procedures. Together, their testimony would reconstruct an investigation spanning more than a decade. Each witness represented one chapter. Together, they formed the complete story. The defense, as expected, prepared its own strategy. In every criminal prosecution, the accused is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That principle remains fundamental regardless of public opinion. Defense attorneys examine weaknesses. Question assumptions. Challenge forensic interpretations where appropriate. Their role is not to prove innocence. It is to test the prosecution's case. The adversarial process exists to ensure that verdicts rest upon reliable evidence rather than emotion. For the Chavez family, however, legal principles existed alongside deeply personal memories. Court hearings could not restore birthdays lost. They could not replace family gatherings forever altered. No verdict could undo January 20, 2012. The calendar cannot move backward. Time grants many things. It does not grant second chances. As media organizations revisited the case, they also highlighted the broader evolution of forensic science. Only a generation earlier, investigators confronting an unknown DNA profile with no database match often reached a dead end. Today, investigative genetic genealogy has transformed that landscape. The same biological evidence once considered insufficient can now identify suspects through distant familial relationships, providing investigators with entirely new investigative pathways. The Chavez investigation became another reminder that evidence collected carefully today may solve crimes many years from now. A cotton swab. A sealed envelope. A laboratory freezer. Objects that appear ordinary can become extraordinary with enough patience. The story of Iracema Chavez was no longer only about a brutal homicide. It had become a story about persistence. About investigators who refused to abandon a victim. About forensic scientists who continued improving the tools available to law enforcement. And about a family whose hope endured through 14 years of unanswered questions. Yet beneath all the courtroom preparation, all the forensic science, and all the legal arguments, one reality remained impossible to ignore. A woman had walked into her apartment expecting another ordinary day. She never walked out again. Everything that followed, the investigation, the technology, the arrest, the prosecution, began with those final moments behind a closed door. Moments whose full truth may never be known except by two people. One lost her life. The other now faced the justice system after years spent believing the past had been left behind. There is a quiet misconception that solving a cold case brings an immediate sense of peace. Reality is far more complicated. When detectives identify a suspect after years of uncertainty, the investigation does not simply end. In many ways, it begins again. Every unanswered question returns with renewed urgency. Every witness is reconsidered. Every forgotten detail is examined through a different lens. What once appeared insignificant may suddenly become essential. That is exactly what happened in the murder investigation of Iracema Chavez. The DNA match had identified Rudy Ornelas as the suspect connected to biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. It was a breakthrough investigators had pursued for 14 years. But even with that extraordinary development, detectives still faced the difficult task of reconstructing a crime that had unfolded behind closed doors with no surviving eyewitnesses. Homicide investigations are rarely complete puzzles. More often, they resemble broken mirrors. Each fragment reflects part of the truth. No single piece reveals the entire picture. Investigators began reviewing every interaction surrounding Chavez's life in the days leading up to her death. Friends. Relatives. Co-workers. Neighbors. Anyone who might help explain the circumstances surrounding her final hours. Some interviews were conducted again after many years. Others were compared against statements given in 2012. Experienced detectives understand that consistency can be as revealing as contradiction. People may forget small details over time. They rarely invent the same memories twice. The review produced a timeline that was far stronger than the one available during the original investigation. Not because new witnesses had suddenly appeared, but because investigators now knew where to focus their attention. Every question could be asked with purpose. Instead of wondering whether someone might be connected to the crime, detectives could explore how existing evidence aligned with a suspect who had already been identified through forensic science. The apartment itself had long since returned to ordinary use. Fresh paint had covered old walls. New flooring had replaced damaged surfaces. Furniture had come and gone. Nothing remained that visually connected it to the horrific violence of January 2012. Yet investigators still possessed hundreds of crime scene photographs. Every image preserved details that no renovation could erase. Blood patterns. Object placement. Evidence markers. Measurements. Doorways. Hallways. The photographs became a permanent record of a room frozen in time. Crime scene reconstruction specialists often describe photographs as silent witnesses. They do not change. They do not forget. They cannot be influenced by emotion. Every review offered another opportunity to understand what happened inside the apartment during those final moments. The extraordinary number of stab wounds remained one of the defining characteristics of the homicide. Public reporting has consistently described the attack as involving approximately 100 stab wounds, making it one of the most violent killings investigated by the Arlington Police Department in recent memory. But investigators remained disciplined. Violence alone does not explain motive. It cannot identify intent beyond the physical evidence. Some observers immediately assume that extreme violence always indicates a deeply personal relationship. Others suggest emotional rage. Professional investigators know better than to make absolute assumptions. Every homicide follows its own path. Evidence, not intuition, must lead the investigation. As prosecutors continued preparing the case, they also anticipated one unavoidable reality. The defense would likely challenge the reliability of evidence collected so many years earlier. That challenge is common in cold case prosecutions. Time affects memories. It does not affect properly preserved DNA. The prosecution's confidence rested largely on that distinction. Biological evidence follows scientific rules. It either matches or it does not. The laboratory comparison linking Ornelas to the biological evidence recovered from Chavez's apartment represented the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Everything else would provide context. The DNA provided identification. For the Chavez family, however, science could answer only one question. Who? It could not answer why. That word continued to echo through every conversation. Why her? Why that morning? Why such extraordinary violence? Why had someone chosen to end the life of a 32-year-old woman in such a brutal manner? Some questions remain beyond the reach of forensic laboratories. Only the people present during a crime know every word spoken. Every decision made. Every emotion experienced. When only one person survives, complete certainty often disappears forever. That uncertainty is one of the deepest wounds carried by families of homicide victims. Even successful prosecutions cannot fully reconstruct the final minutes of a loved one's life. Meanwhile, investigators reflected on how differently the case might have unfolded had biological evidence not been preserved so carefully. Modern forensic investigations place enormous emphasis on evidence collection because today's limitations may become tomorrow's opportunities. A sample considered insufficient in one decade may become decisive in the next. The Chavez investigation became a textbook example. The DNA profile recovered in 2012 had failed to identify a suspect using available databases. Years later, the same profile became the key that unlocked the entire investigation through advances in investigative genetic genealogy and direct comparison testing. Nothing about the evidence itself had changed. Only the science. That realization resonated across law enforcement. Cold case units throughout the country had already begun revisiting unsolved homicides with preserved biological evidence. Every successful identification strengthened confidence in reopening additional investigations. Families who had nearly abandoned hope suddenly received phone calls from detectives asking to discuss cases that had remained silent for decades. Science was changing expectations. Not every cold case would be solved. But many no longer appeared impossible. The murder of Iracema Chavez joined a growing list of investigations demonstrating that time is no longer the protection it once seemed to be. For offenders who believed patience guaranteed freedom, forensic technology had quietly rewritten the rules. Years of silence could now become years of accumulating evidence. Every advance in DNA analysis narrowed the distance between unsolved crimes and accountability. As public attention returned to the Chavez case, many people expressed admiration for the investigators who had refused to let the file disappear permanently. Cold case detectives often work without immediate rewards. Their investigations rarely produce quick arrests. They spend months reviewing reports that others have already read. They revisit interviews conducted years earlier. They search for overlooked details buried beneath thousands of pages of documentation. Progress comes slowly. Sometimes painfully slowly. But persistence occasionally produces extraordinary results. The Chavez investigation became one of those results. Yet the emotional center of the case remained unchanged. A family had lost someone they loved. No forensic breakthrough could restore birthdays that had passed. No courtroom proceeding could erase 14 years of absence. Justice operates within legal boundaries. Grief does not. As preparations continued, prosecutors understood that jurors would inevitably feel the emotional weight of the case. They would hear about a woman whose life ended inside the place where she should have been safest. They would hear about an investigation that refused to surrender despite years without answers. They would hear about scientific advances that transformed forgotten evidence into the foundation of a murder prosecution. But they would also be instructed to decide the case based solely upon admissible evidence presented in court. Emotion could explain why the case mattered. Evidence would determine its outcome. Outside the courtroom, the apartment complex remained remarkably ordinary. Residents carried groceries upstairs. Children rode bicycles across the parking lot. Neighbors greeted one another without realizing that beneath layers of renovation in passing years, the location still occupied a permanent place in Arlington's criminal history. Places remember. Even when people try not to. The walls no longer bore signs of violence. The floors had been replaced. The blood had disappeared. But history has a way of lingering long after physical traces have vanished. For detectives who first entered that apartment in January 2012, every return to the photographs reopened memories they never truly left behind. They remembered the silence. The overwhelming brutality. The determination shared by everyone at the scene that morning. Someone had done this. Someone would eventually answer for it. 14 years later, that promise finally appeared within reach. Not because a witness suddenly remembered a forgotten face. Not because the suspect confessed. Not because luck intervened. Because science quietly preserved the voice of evidence until investigators possessed the tools necessary to hear it. And as the legal process moved forward, another question slowly emerged beneath the headlines. Not whether investigators had found a suspect. But whether 14 years of waiting would finally end with the justice that Iracema Chavez's family had spent so long hoping to see. Justice is often imagined as a single moment. A pair of handcuffs. A courtroom verdict. A judge's sentence. In reality, justice is a process measured in thousands of decisions, each one carrying the weight of years. It is built by detectives who refuse to close a file simply because the trail has gone cold. It is protected by evidence technicians who understand that the smallest biological sample may one day become the loudest witness. It is sustained by families who continue answering investigators' phone calls long after hope should have disappeared. For the family of Iracema Chavez, 14 years had passed between the morning their world collapsed and the moment investigators announced they had identified a suspect. 14 years of unanswered birthdays. 14 years of empty chairs at family gatherings. 14 years of wondering whether the person responsible had escaped forever. No calendar can measure that kind of waiting. The public often sees only the headlines. Cold case solved. DNA leads to arrest. Suspect identified after 14 years. Behind those headlines lies another story. One of relentless persistence. One that unfolds quietly, without television cameras or dramatic confrontations. After Rudy Ornelas was identified through the DNA evidence, prosecutors began the meticulous process of preparing for court. Every scientific finding had to be organized into a form that 12 jurors, most with no background in forensic biology, could understand. The challenge was not simply proving that the DNA matched. It was explaining why that match mattered. DNA evidence carries extraordinary persuasive power, but prosecutors cannot assume jurors automatically understand its significance. Experts must explain how profiles are generated, how contamination is prevented, how statistical probabilities are calculated, and why modern forensic laboratories treat every biological sample with extraordinary caution. Each explanation serves a single purpose. Confidence. Not emotional confidence. Scientific confidence. Because criminal trials demand proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The laboratory analysts who examined the Chavez evidence were expected to explain procedures that began years earlier, when investigators first collected biological material from the apartment. Every seal. Every evidence bag. Every transfer. Every laboratory record. Nothing could be left unexplained. The strength of forensic evidence lies not only in the science itself but in the documentation proving that the evidence remained secure from the moment it was collected until the day it appeared in court. Cold case prosecutions depend heavily upon that continuity. A missing record. An unexplained transfer. A broken evidence seal. Any of these issues could raise difficult questions during trial. The Chavez investigation avoided those pitfalls because investigators had treated the evidence as though it might one day become the centerpiece of a prosecution. That day had finally arrived. Outside legal circles, the case also reignited public discussion about investigative genetic genealogy. For many people, the technique still seemed almost unbelievable. How could investigators identify someone who had never submitted DNA to a criminal database? The answer lay in family relationships. Human beings inherit genetic material from parents, grandparents, and generations before them. Distant relatives share identifiable portions of that inheritance. When individuals voluntarily upload their genetic information to genealogy services that permit law enforcement comparisons under specific legal conditions, investigators may identify previously unknown family connections. Those connections do not identify a suspect automatically. They generate leads. Genealogists then perform painstaking research, reconstructing family histories that can stretch back generations. Birth certificates. Marriage licenses. Obituaries. Military records. Census data. Public archives become investigative tools. The process is slow. Often taking months. Sometimes years. Only after investigators narrow the possibilities to a specific individual do they seek a direct DNA comparison capable of confirming, or eliminating, that person as a suspect. The Chavez investigation followed precisely that pattern. The genealogy pointed investigators toward Rudy Ornelas. The direct DNA comparison provided the scientific confirmation. Two separate stages. Two different purposes. One investigative breakthrough. The success of the case carried implications far beyond Arlington. Across the country, police departments facing thousands of unsolved murders watched developments closely. Each successful identification strengthened confidence that preserved evidence from decades-old investigations might still speak. Technology had fundamentally altered the balance between offenders and investigators. Years earlier, criminals sometimes assumed that avoiding arrest for long enough meant permanent freedom. That assumption no longer held true. Every improvement in forensic science reduced the protective value of time. Evidence once considered inconclusive could suddenly become decisive. Old investigations became new opportunities. For families of victims, this shift represented something profoundly important. Hope backed by science. Not speculation. Not rumors. Evidence. The Chavez family understood that distinction better than anyone. Throughout the investigation, they had cooperated with detectives despite years without visible progress. Families often continue supporting investigators long after public attention fades because they understand something the public does not. Cold cases rarely remain completely inactive. Detectives revisit them. Laboratories develop new techniques. Evidence is reviewed again. Progress simply occurs out of sight. That invisible work finally produced results. As media organizations covered the arrest, many emphasized another remarkable aspect of the case. The biological evidence had remained useful despite 14 years passing between collection and identification. That outcome was not accidental. Proper evidence preservation follows strict scientific standards designed specifically to prevent degradation. Temperature. Packaging. Humidity. Documentation. Every procedure exists because investigators cannot predict which evidence will become significant years later. One cotton swab may ultimately outweigh hundreds of witness interviews. One microscopic trace can identify someone who leaves no fingerprints, no confession, and no eyewitness behind. Science speaks softly, but with extraordinary precision. The brutality of Chavez's murder continued attracting attention as journalists revisited the case. Approximately 100 stab wounds. The number remained almost impossible for many readers to comprehend. Yet investigators consistently resisted turning that detail into unsupported conclusions. Professional homicide investigators recognize that violence reflects actions, not necessarily explanations. Only the offender truly knows what thoughts existed during those final moments inside the apartment. Everything else must be supported by evidence. That discipline separates investigation from speculation. The legal process demands nothing less. As preparations continued, prosecutors anticipated another challenge. Time changes people. Witnesses age. Voices sound different. Appearances change. Memories soften around the edges. Defense attorneys often remind jurors that recollections formed years earlier may contain natural inconsistencies. That reality is one reason physical evidence becomes increasingly valuable in cold cases. Unlike memory, properly preserved DNA does not become less reliable with age. It remains exactly what it was on the day investigators collected it. A biological snapshot. Frozen in time. For detectives who had worked the Chavez investigation from its earliest days, the prosecution represented more than a professional achievement. It represented the fulfillment of a promise. Every homicide investigator understands the silent commitment made while standing inside a murder scene. Someone deserves answers. Someone deserves accountability. Sometimes those answers arrive within hours. Sometimes within days. Occasionally, they require 14 years. Persistence becomes part of the investigation itself. Meanwhile, the community around Arlington found itself revisiting memories that had nearly disappeared. Residents who had once watched police vehicles surround the apartment complex now learned that the investigation had never truly ended. The silence had been deceptive. Behind closed laboratory doors, inside evidence vaults, and across countless investigative meetings, the search had continued. The arrest reminded the public that unsolved does not necessarily mean unsolvable. Some mysteries simply wait for the right moment. The right technology. The right question. And perhaps that is the most haunting aspect of the Chavez case. For 14 years, the answer existed. Not hidden in some distant place. Not locked inside a forgotten witness's memory. It was present from the very beginning. Invisible to the science of 2012. Visible to the science of today. The killer had left behind his own identity without realizing it. He carried the truth inside every cell of his body. He walked freely for years while that truth remained sealed inside an evidence locker, silent but patient. Waiting. Not for luck. Not for coincidence. For science to become powerful enough to reveal a name that time could no longer protect. For years, the file bearing Iracema Chavez's name occupied the same quiet space shared by countless unsolved homicide investigations across America. It rested on shelves beside other folders containing photographs, witness statements, forensic reports, and unanswered questions. Every one of those files represented a life interrupted, a family waiting, and a promise made by investigators that the search for truth would not simply end because the calendar continued moving forward. The Chavez investigation was different now. The file was no longer gathering dust. It was moving. Evidence once reviewed in frustration was now being examined with purpose. Every page acquired new meaning because detectives finally knew whose name belonged beside the unidentified DNA profile recovered from the apartment. The transformation from uncertainty to identification did not erase the mystery overnight. Instead, it shifted the investigation toward a different objective. Understanding. Science had answered one question. Who? But the deeper question still lingered. Why had the attack been so extraordinarily violent? What sequence of events unfolded inside the apartment before the first blow was struck? What thoughts passed through the victim's mind as she realized the danger standing in front of her? No laboratory can answer those questions. DNA identifies. It does not explain. That distinction remained painfully important for everyone involved. As prosecutors refined their case, investigators continued reviewing every known interaction connected to the victim's final days. Even after a suspect has been identified, detectives routinely search for additional corroborating evidence. Telephone activity, employment records, previous interviews, and documented relationships are all re-examined, not because the DNA becomes less significant, but because every additional verified fact strengthens the overall picture presented in court. A homicide prosecution is never built upon a single sentence. It is built upon accumulation. One fact supporting another. One document confirming another. One scientific conclusion reinforced by careful investigative work. The Chavez case reflected that philosophy. Every decision made since January 2012 mattered. Every evidence technician. Every forensic analyst. Every detective who refused to let the case disappear permanently had contributed to the moment now approaching. The public often imagines that investigators experience a dramatic emotional release once a suspect is arrested. Reality is more restrained. Experienced detectives know that arrests do not guarantee convictions. Their work remains unfinished until every piece of evidence has been presented and tested inside a courtroom. That professional discipline explains why investigators speak cautiously even after announcing major breakthroughs. Confidence must rest upon evidence, not optimism. For the family of Iracema Chavez, however, emotions naturally extended beyond legal procedure. 14 years is long enough for children to become adults. Long enough for careers to begin and end. Long enough for entire chapters of life to unfold without the person whose absence shaped every family gathering. The arrest reopened grief that had never truly closed. News reports often describe such moments as bringing closure. Families frequently describe them differently. The arrest does not close the wound. It simply changes the questions. Instead of asking whether anyone will ever be identified, families begin asking what the courtroom will reveal. Will the evidence explain the motive? Will the accused speak? Will hidden details finally emerge? Or will some mysteries remain unanswered forever? Those uncertainties followed the Chavez family as the legal process continued. Meanwhile, the investigation attracted renewed attention from forensic professionals across the country. The case became another illustration of how biological evidence collected years earlier could become decisive through advances in investigative science. Crime laboratories increasingly emphasize preservation because no one can predict which future technology may unlock evidence that appears inconclusive today. A tiny biological sample may remain silent for years. That silence does not mean the evidence lacks value. It may simply mean the necessary tools have not yet been invented. The Chavez investigation proved exactly that. The DNA profile recovered in 2012 had waited patiently for science to catch up. Nothing about the evidence changed. The technology changed. That distinction has reshaped homicide investigations throughout the United States. Cold case units now revisit evidence once considered exhausted. Forensic laboratories routinely apply modern analytical methods to materials collected decades earlier. Investigators understand that yesterday's dead end may become tomorrow's breakthrough. As media outlets revisited the case, they also reflected on the human cost of violent crime beyond statistics and forensic reports. Every homicide creates concentric circles of loss. Parents, siblings, friends, co-workers, neighbors. Each experiences the tragedy differently. Each carries memories that no scientific discovery can replace. The passage of time softens some pain. It never removes absence. For many people who knew Iracema Chavez, the news of an arrest revived memories that had remained buried beneath everyday life. Conversations resumed. Photographs were shared again. Stories about her personality resurfaced. The victim briefly returned to public attention, not as a crime scene photograph or a case number, but as a human being whose life had mattered long before her death became headline news. That distinction is important. Unsolved homicide cases often become defined by forensic evidence rather than by the people whose lives were stolen. Investigators work tirelessly to identify offenders. Families struggle equally hard to ensure victims are remembered as more than evidence. The Chavez case reflected both realities. Science pursued accountability. Memory preserved humanity. Inside the legal system, prosecutors continued assembling expert testimony. DNA analysts prepared to explain laboratory procedures in language ordinary jurors could understand. Investigators organized timelines. Evidence technicians reviewed chain-of-custody documentation. Each witness represented a different piece of the investigation. Together, they formed a narrative stretching across 14 years. The defense, as expected, prepared to examine every aspect of that narrative. Cross-examination is not merely a courtroom ritual. It is an essential safeguard. Scientific evidence gains credibility because it survives rigorous questioning. Laboratory procedures are tested. Investigative decisions are challenged. Documentation is scrutinized. Reliable evidence withstands those challenges. That process protects both victims and the accused. The justice system demands nothing less. Outside the courtroom, another quiet truth emerged from the Chavez investigation. Technology alone had not solved the case. Human persistence had. Without detectives willing to reopen old files. Without forensic specialists willing to re-examine preserved evidence. Without genealogists patiently reconstructing family histories. The DNA would have remained only a sequence of numbers stored inside laboratory records. Science provides tools. People decide whether to use them. The case also reminded investigators of another lesson learned repeatedly throughout criminal history. Offenders often underestimate evidence they cannot see. Fingerprints can be wiped away. Security cameras can be avoided. Witnesses may never come forward. But biological evidence follows different rules. It accompanies every human being. Every movement. Every struggle. Every injury. Every contact leaves the possibility that something invisible will remain behind. For years, Rudy Ornelas moved through ordinary life while that invisible trace remained preserved inside an evidence vault. He may never have imagined that a microscopic fragment collected in 2012 would one day identify him. He may never have considered that scientific techniques unavailable at the time of the crime would eventually become powerful enough to connect his DNA directly to the apartment where Iracema Chavez lost her life. Time had protected him temporarily. Not permanently. And that realization extended far beyond a single investigation. Across America, thousands of preserved evidence envelopes remain stored inside secure facilities. Each contains unanswered questions. Each contains possibilities. Some may never reveal anything new. Others may already contain the identity of someone who still believes they escaped. The Chavez investigation became a reminder that evidence does not grow impatient. It waits. Quietly. Faithfully. Year after year. Until science becomes capable of hearing the story it has been preserving all along. For 14 years, the truth existed inside a microscopic strand of DNA. Invisible. Silent. Unchanging. Waiting for the day when it would finally speak louder than time itself. The most haunting aspect of a cold case is not always the violence that created it. Sometimes it is the silence that follows. After the crime scene is processed. After the investigators leave. After the news cameras disappear. A community returns to normal life while one family remains trapped in the moment everything changed. For the loved ones of Iracema Chavez, January 20, 2012, was not simply a date on a calendar. It was the dividing line between before and after. Before that morning, there was a daughter, a friend, a woman with ordinary plans and ordinary worries. After that morning, there was an investigation, a missing future, and 14 years of questions without answers. The arrest of Rudy Ornelas changed the direction of the case, but it could not change the past. No DNA match could bring back the sound of Chavez's voice. No courtroom could return the years stolen from her family. No verdict could erase the image of an apartment transformed into a crime scene. Justice can identify responsibility. It cannot reverse loss. That reality is understood by every investigator who works homicide cases. Behind every evidence file is a person. Behind every case number is a family. Behind every unanswered question is someone waiting. The Chavez investigation had now become part of a larger national conversation about the power of forensic science and the future of cold case investigations. But beneath the technology, beneath the headlines, beneath the courtroom strategy, the central story remained painfully human. A woman was killed. Someone was responsible. And for years, that person remained unidentified. The breakthrough came through DNA, but the path toward that breakthrough required patience that few people outside law enforcement ever see. Investigators who work cold cases often describe their job as searching through history. They return to old reports. They examine forgotten details. They compare information that may have seemed unrelated years earlier. The challenge is that time changes everything except the evidence itself. People move. Relationships change. Memories fade. But physical evidence remains a connection between the past and the present. In the Chavez case, that connection was biological. A genetic signature left behind during the crime. A silent witness that never changed its story. As investigators continued preparing the case, they also had to consider how to explain the passage of time. 14 years between a murder and an arrest can create questions. Why did it take so long? Was something missed? Could the suspect have been identified earlier? Those questions are natural. They are also complex. Forensic technology in 2012 was not the same as forensic technology years later. Investigative genetic genealogy was still developing. The databases, analytical methods, and investigative frameworks that exist today were not available in the same form when Chavez was killed. The evidence was present. The capability to interpret it had evolved. This difference represents one of the most important lessons in modern criminal investigation. A case is not always unsolved because investigators failed. Sometimes the science simply has not reached the point where the evidence can reveal its full meaning. A fingerprint discovered decades ago might become valuable after improved analysis. A digital record once considered useless might later provide a timeline. A DNA profile once unable to identify anyone might eventually point directly toward a suspect. The future can change the meaning of the past. That concept has transformed how police departments approach old investigations. The phrase, cold case, no longer carries the same sense of finality it once did. It describes a case without current activity. Not a case without hope. For families of homicide victims, that distinction matters. Hope may be painful. It can feel impossible after years of disappointment. But the possibility of justice remains alive as long as evidence remains available. The Chavez investigation became an example of that possibility. A case that appeared frozen suddenly moved forward. A name that had been unknown became known. A suspect who had remained outside the focus of public attention became the center of a homicide investigation. The transition was dramatic. But behind it was a careful, deliberate process. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Only evidence. As the case developed, attention also turned toward Rudy Ornelas himself. The identification of a suspect often creates another wave of questions from the public. Who was he? Did anyone around him suspect anything? Did he display warning signs? Could someone have known? These questions appear in nearly every high-profile homicide investigation. Yet hindsight can create illusions. People often search for obvious clues after a crime has been solved. They look backward and try to find signs that should have predicted the future. In reality, many violent crimes are committed by individuals who appear ordinary in everyday settings. The ability to blend into normal life is one reason some offenders remain unidentified for years. Investigators focus not on appearances, but on evidence. A person's reputation does not determine guilt. A person's lifestyle does not prove innocence. The criminal justice system requires facts. That principle remained central throughout the Chavez prosecution. The DNA evidence created a powerful connection. But the courtroom would examine the entire case. Every detail. Every procedure. Every argument. As prosecutors prepared, they understood the emotional weight of presenting the case to a jury. They would not only be explaining forensic science. They would be telling the story of a woman whose life ended unexpectedly. A woman whose name had remained attached to a mystery for more than a decade. A woman whose family continued waiting for answers. Victim-centered investigations require balance. The goal is not only to prove what happened. It is also to remember who was lost. That became especially important as media coverage increased. Crime stories often focus naturally on the offender. The suspect. The investigation. The arrest. But behind every criminal case is a victim whose life existed long before the crime. Iracema Chavez was not defined by the circumstances of her death. She was defined by the life she lived before it. The relationships she built. The people who cared about her. The memories that remained. That perspective shaped how many investigators spoke about the case. They did not describe a solved crime as an ending. They described it as accountability for a life taken away. Meanwhile, forensic experts continued to emphasize a message that has become increasingly important in the modern era. DNA does not solve crimes alone. It creates opportunities. Human investigation completes the picture. The Chavez case required both. The science identified a connection. Detectives interpreted that connection. Prosecutors prepared to present it. A courtroom would ultimately determine its meaning. Every stage mattered. Every person involved carried responsibility. Because in a homicide case, mistakes do not simply affect a file. They affect real people. For 14 years, the Chavez family waited for progress. Now, progress had arrived. But the final chapter still had to be written. The courtroom would become the next battlefield, not one of violence, but of evidence. The prosecution would attempt to demonstrate that the DNA connection was part of a larger truth. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge that conclusion. And somewhere at the center of it all remained the same unanswered question that had existed since January 2012. What truly happened inside that apartment? The DNA had revealed a name. The investigation had revealed a suspect. But the full story of Iracema Chavez's final moments remained locked away, waiting for the justice system to uncover what happened behind that closed door 14 years earlier. Because even when science solves a mystery, the human story is never finished. A courtroom does something that a crime scene cannot. It forces the past to speak. For 14 years, the murder of Iracema Chavez existed through fragments. Photographs. Evidence reports. Laboratory results. Memories of investigators who had walked through a devastating scene in 2012. But inside a courtroom, those fragments would be placed together, examined, challenged, and transformed into a story that 12 strangers would ultimately be asked to judge. The story of what happened inside an Arlington apartment. The story of a woman whose life ended violently. The story of a DNA profile that remained silent until science finally gave it a voice. As the legal process moved forward, the central issue became clear. Could prosecutors prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Rudy Ornelas was responsible for the murder of Iracema Chavez? The answer would depend on more than one piece of evidence. Although DNA was the breakthrough that identified the suspect, criminal trials are built through a complete presentation of facts. The prosecution would need to explain how investigators moved from an unknown biological sample to a named individual. They would need to explain why that connection was reliable. They would need to show how the evidence recovered from the crime scene remained connected to the suspect years later. Forensic science can appear almost absolute when viewed from a distance. But inside a courtroom, every scientific conclusion must be carefully explained. Jurors are not laboratory technicians. They do not spend their lives studying genetic markers or probability calculations. Their responsibility is to understand the evidence and determine whether it proves guilt to the required legal standard. That process requires patience. It requires clarity. And it requires trust in properly conducted science. The DNA evidence became the foundation of the prosecution's argument. Investigators had recovered biological material during the original homicide investigation. At the time, available technology could not identify the person connected to that profile. Years later, advances in forensic methods created a path forward. Investigative genetic genealogy provided a lead. A direct DNA comparison provided confirmation. The timeline itself became part of the story. The evidence had existed from the beginning. The ability to interpret it had arrived later. That difference represented one of the most important developments in modern criminal investigations. Technology does not change the past. It changes what humanity can discover about the past. The Chavez case demonstrated that principle in the most personal way possible. A family spent years wondering whether answers would ever come. Investigators spent years hoping that a new opportunity would emerge. Eventually, that opportunity arrived through science. But science alone could not explain everything. The courtroom would still have to examine the circumstances surrounding the homicide. The physical evidence. The investigative steps. The timeline. The relationship, if any, between Chavez and the person accused of killing her. Questions remained. And prosecutors understood that unanswered questions could become the focus of the defense. Every criminal case contains uncertainty. The role of the justice system is not to demand perfection. It is to determine whether the evidence meets the legal standard required for conviction. That distinction is essential. A defendant is not convicted because a case feels emotionally compelling. A defendant is convicted because evidence proves guilt. As the case attracted renewed attention, many people revisited the disturbing details that had shocked the Arlington community in 2012. The violent nature of the attack. The fact that Chavez was found inside her own residence. The years that passed without an arrest. Each detail contributed to the public's understanding of why the case had remained unforgettable. Yet investigators continued emphasizing a critical point. The victim must remain at the center of the story. Not only the crime. Not only the suspect. Not only the investigation. Iracema Chavez was more than the circumstances surrounding her death. She was a person whose life had existed before the headlines. She had family members who knew her laugh. Friends who remembered conversations. People who experienced the loss not as a news event, but as a permanent change to their lives. That human reality followed the case through every stage. Cold cases create a unique emotional burden because the absence of answers becomes part of daily life. Families often live with two separate realities. The world sees an unsolved crime. They experience a missing piece of their own lives. The arrest of a suspect after 14 years could not erase that experience. But it represented something families of victims often describe as essential. Recognition. The acknowledgement that what happened mattered. That the victim had not been forgotten. That someone was still searching. Inside the investigative community, the Chavez case also reinforced the importance of preserving evidence from the earliest moments of an investigation. Detectives handling crime scenes rarely know which evidence will become decisive years later. A sample collected today may not solve a case today. But future technology may transform it. That uncertainty changes how investigators approach every scene. They collect. They document. They preserve. Because every piece of evidence represents a possibility. In the Chavez case, that possibility survived for 14 years. The evidence waded through changing technology, changing investigators, and changing circumstances. It remained unchanged. The suspect's DNA was not discovered because of a lucky accident. It was discovered because investigators had protected the possibility that one day it could matter. As the courtroom process continued, experts prepared to explain another important aspect of forensic genealogy. The technique does not produce instant answers. Public perception sometimes imagines investigators entering DNA information into a computer and immediately receiving a name. Reality is far more complicated. Genetic genealogy involves extensive research. Scientists and investigators analyze genetic relationships, build family trees, eliminate unrelated branches, and compare information from multiple sources. It is detective work combined with science. The laboratory provides data. Human reasoning creates understanding. That combination transformed the Chavez investigation. Without the genetic connection, investigators might never have known where to look. Without traditional police work, the genetic information alone would have remained incomplete. The case was solved because different methods worked together. Technology. Persistence. Investigation. Years of experience. As the trial preparation continued, the shadow of January 2012 remained impossible to ignore. Investigators returned repeatedly to the same question. What happened during the final moments of Iracema Chavez's life? A courtroom can present evidence. It can establish responsibility. But sometimes, the complete emotional truth of a crime remains unreachable. There are moments only the victim and offender experienced. Moments lost forever. That reality is one of the hardest aspects of homicide cases. Even when justice arrives, some answers may never come. The Chavez family would eventually have to confront that painful possibility. The person accused of taking Iracema's life could be identified. The evidence could be presented. A verdict could be reached. But no legal decision could fully explain the loss of 14 years. No sentence could restore what was taken. Still, accountability mattered. Because without accountability, the silence would remain. And silence was something the Chavez family had already endured for too long. The arrest had broken that silence. The DNA had broken that silence. Now the courtroom would determine whether the evidence was strong enough to transform a 14-year mystery into a final judgment. For investigators, it represented the completion of a mission that began on a tragic morning in Arlington. For prosecutors, it represented the responsibility of presenting a case built upon years of work. For the family, it represented something far more personal. A chance to finally hear the name of the person accused of ending Iracema Chavez's life. A chance to see the justice system recognize what they had known all along. That someone was responsible. And after 14 years of waiting, the truth was finally standing in the light. For 14 years, the murder of Iracema Chavez existed in the space between memory and uncertainty. Her name remained attached to a question. Who killed her? That question followed investigators through years of dead ends, through evidence reviews, through technological changes, and through countless moments when the answer seemed just beyond reach. But cold cases are not only stories about what investigators discover. They are also stories about what they refuse to forget. The breakthrough in the Chavez investigation represented the end of one search. But it also revealed something deeper about the nature of justice. The passage of time does not erase responsibility. It only changes the path required to find it. When investigators first entered Chavez's apartment in January 2012, they could not know that the smallest pieces of evidence collected that day would eventually become the foundation of a future prosecution. They could not know that forensic science would advance in ways that would transform the investigation. They could not know that a DNA profile with no name would one day point directly toward the person accused of taking Chavez's life. But they preserved the evidence anyway. That decision became the difference between an unanswered mystery and a reopened investigation. Inside homicide units across America, detectives understand a difficult reality. Most cases are solved through immediate action. A witness comes forward. A suspect is identified. Evidence is collected quickly. The investigation moves forward while memories remain fresh. Cold cases operate differently. They require patience. They require the ability to look at old information with new eyes. They require investigators to believe that today's unanswered question may become tomorrow's solved case. The Chavez investigation followed that pattern. Years passed without an arrest. The case remained unresolved. But it was never abandoned. That distinction mattered. The public often sees only the moment of breakthrough. The arrest. The press conference. The headline announcing that a suspect has finally been identified. What the public does not see is the quiet work that happens before that moment. Detectives reading thousands of pages of reports. Analysts examining evidence. Researchers reconstructing family connections. Scientists testing possibilities. Every successful cold case resolution is built upon countless hours that remain invisible. The Chavez case was no different. The role of DNA became the defining element of the investigation. For decades, DNA evidence has transformed criminal justice by providing a level of identification previously impossible through traditional methods. Before DNA analysis became widely available, investigators often relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, fingerprints, and physical evidence that could be directly linked to individuals. Those methods remain important. But DNA introduced something unique. A biological connection. A trace left behind by the human body itself. Unlike memories, DNA does not change with time. Unlike stories, DNA cannot be altered by fear, confusion, or personal motives. It carries information silently. In the Chavez investigation, that silent information remained preserved until the right technology allowed investigators to interpret it. The process demonstrated an important principle. Evidence does not become stronger because it is older. It becomes stronger when science becomes better. That concept has changed the way law enforcement approaches unsolved crimes. A case once considered impossible may now be considered unfinished. The difference between those two ideas is enormous. Impossible means there is no path forward. Unfinished means the path has not yet been discovered. For the Chavez family, that distinction represented 14 years of uncertainty. They lived with a question that many families of homicide victims know too well. Will anyone ever be held responsible? The arrest of Rudy Ornelas changed the answer from uncertainty to possibility. But the emotional journey did not end there. Families often describe a complicated mixture of emotions when a cold case is solved. Relief. Anger. Sadness. Hope. Even happiness can feel complicated because celebrating an arrest also means revisiting the pain that created it. A solved case forces families to confront memories they may have spent years trying to survive. The crime becomes real again. The headlines return. The photographs return. The details they hoped would fade come back into focus. But alongside that pain is something equally powerful. Validation. The confirmation that their loved one was not forgotten. That investigators continued searching. That the world had not completely moved on. The Chavez investigation carried that message. Iracema Chavez's name remained in the case file because someone continued looking for answers. The investigation survived because evidence survived. And the evidence survived because people believed it might one day matter. As the legal process progressed, another important issue emerged. The difference between solving a case and understanding a case. Solving means identifying the person believed responsible. Understanding requires something more. It requires motive. It requires context. It requires knowing what led to the crime. In many homicide cases, that second part remains incomplete. A suspect may be identified. A conviction may occur. But the exact reason behind a violent act may never be fully known. That uncertainty can be especially painful for families. They may receive justice without receiving every answer. They may know who caused the loss without ever understanding why. The Chavez case carried that same unanswered dimension. The DNA evidence could identify the person connected to the crime scene. It could not reveal every thought, every decision, or every emotion that existed inside that apartment. Those final moments belonged only to the people who were there. And one of them was no longer alive to tell the story. That reality gives cold cases their lasting emotional power. They are not only investigations. They are unfinished conversations. The victim's voice is gone. The family waits. Investigators search. Science attempts to bridge the gap. In this case, science succeeded in answering the most important question. A name emerged from the evidence. But the tragedy itself remained. A life was lost. A family was changed forever. A community was forced to remember a crime it had hoped would someday be solved. The Chavez case also became another example of how forensic technology continues to reshape criminal investigations. Every year, methods improve. Every year, laboratories gain new capabilities. Every year, evidence once considered limited becomes more valuable. That progress creates new possibilities for thousands of families still waiting. Some cases will remain unsolved. Some evidence will never provide answers. But others may follow the same path as Chavez. A forgotten sample. A renewed investigation. A scientific breakthrough. A name finally revealed. For offenders who believed time was protection, the message became increasingly clear. Time does not destroy evidence. Sometimes, it preserves it. The person responsible for a crime may change their appearance. They may move. They may build a new life. They may believe the past has disappeared. But the evidence left behind remains connected to the moment when the crime occurred. Years can pass. Decades can pass. But a single biological trace can survive longer than a person's attempt to escape accountability. That was the reality revealed by the murder of Iracema Chavez. 14 years of silence. 14 years of uncertainty. 14 years during which a question remained unanswered. Then one day, a scientific breakthrough changed everything. The unknown DNA profile had a name. The cold case had a suspect. The victim's story returned to public attention. And a community that had once wondered whether justice would ever come finally saw that even the oldest wounds can be reopened, not to cause more pain, but to finally allow the truth to emerge. Yet one final challenge remained. A courtroom would still need to decide what happened. A jury would still need to weigh the evidence. And after 14 years of waiting, the search for justice would reach its most important moment. The moment when evidence would no longer exist only inside reports and laboratories. The moment when the story of Iracema Chavez would be placed before the world.